agenda. So in reality, nothing I'm going to share with you today hasn't been in the British media, certainly in some way, shape or form over the years. Now, of course, it's all put out there on a fragmented basis, so that it's very difficult for the average person who's got a job and has to raise the money to pay the mortgage and everything else. They don't have time to investigate and research this. So what I fortunately do. So really what I'm trying to do is share with you my research, but on the basis that hopefully it will sow seeds with you and stimulate you and encourage you to go and do your own research. So Codex Alimentarius, which simply translates as Global Food Code, but I'm going to take this flyer from Scott Tipps's website, the National Health Federation, because I think this pretty much sums up the issue. The Codex Alimentarius Commission has been around basically since the early 1960s. But here, on the opening part of this flyer, which is downloadable from Scott's website, Codex Alimentarius, the silent stalker of your health freedom. Never heard of Codex? That's exactly what they want. They choose a phrase that doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. And in the British media, there can be discussions on issues that are clearly directly related to Codex Alimentarius, but you'll never see the phrase Codex Alimentarius in the media. It's almost like there's an agreement not to mention it, a blackout on it. So the Codex agenda is only low-potency Me Too supplements available that will do nothing for your health. And certainly, my supposition is that the intent is to completely eradicate all natural health products. And what absolutely staggers me, and how I actually got into this in the first place, was because when I realised 3 years ago that Codex was very well advanced in terms of establishing the template for global legislation, I live in a place in south-west England called Totnes, which prides itself as being the alternative capital of Europe. But their heads are so far up their rear... I don't know. So here we have the largest concentration, supposedly, of complementary and alternative therapists in Western Europe. We have a very large concentration of organic farmland, and yet those people whose livelihoods are involved in those professions have no clue, and to date, very little interest in what's occurring. It's like, it's not happening tomorrow, it's not happening next week, it's not happening next month, so it's not a problem. Well, we may be looking at the last generation of alternative and complementary health professionals, particularly in Western Europe, and maybe perhaps even globally. All or most foods genetically modified. We'll look at this as we go through the presentation, but in 1980, there wasn't a single acre of GM food being grown anywhere on the planet. In 2002, there were 250,000 acres dedicated to GM foods. Today, it's estimated to be over 10 million acres. Beneficial supplements unavailable or sold by prescription only. And I'll show you how that appeared in the British media about 2 years ago. Let me introduce you to this guy. Some of you may have heard of him, a guy called Marc.vg. He was a Harvard student, and to make some extra money, he joined a party going down to the South American jungle as a bag carrier. But he was so enthralled by what he saw there amongst the indigenous peoples with regard to their usage of the natural environment, particularly as it related to their health. But he managed to change his course to ethnobotany and went back to South America to study ethnobotany. And he managed to hook up with the shaman of a tribe that had very little contact with the outside world. And so much so that when he arrived there, first time around, all the people, the local villagers, basically ran around naked. In fact, the only piece of clothing was a piece of twine that the men used to wear around their waist. which he later learned was to tuck a certain appendage under when they were hunting to stop it catching on some foliage. Plotkin spent the time with the shaman, and because there was no written language with this tribe, he was actually learning the trade like orally and then writing it down. But when he went back to the US to finance, or help finance his studies, he sold some of his research to a pharmaceutical company. Well, he didn't manage to get back to that tribe for some 7 years. But when he did get back there, he was shocked by what he saw. Because instead of the tribe being naked, they were all wearing like cut-off Levi's and Hawaiian shirts. So he asked why they were wearing these clothes, and he was told, he said, oh, it's the missionaries. They told us we were naked. Well, he shrugged that one off. But then he went into the shaman's hut, and gone were all the bundles of plants and herbs and barks and everything else that was mixed locally. And in its place was little brown bottles. And he asked the shaman, he said, what's with this? And the shaman said, well, the missionaries have told us that we cannot use the plants because that's the work of the devil. We have to use these medicines which come from your country. Well, he walked over to the shelf and picked up a bottle at random, and he realized that this was the synthesized recipe from the research that he had sold to a pharmaceutical company in the US some 7 years previously. And he vowed never again would he sell his research. In fact, he ended up setting up his own company to manufacture the natural products. But this continues. This continues in Iraq. With the invasion of 2003, we know very, very well that Tony Blair and George Bush lied their butts off to take Saddam out of office. But it goes way deeper than that. Saddam had effectively tried to rebuild Iraq. He actually believed that he was the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, and that he believed that his mission was to rebuild, re-establish Babylon. Well, some people had other ideas. And when the troops went into, the American British troops went into Iraq, they looted the place. And they made a beeline for the museum in Baghdad and looted many of the Sumerian tablets and relics, many of which had not been deciphered. Because there was great concern with the rising awareness of the information on the Sumerian tablets, that the information may completely undermine the Judeo-Christian philosophical basis in the Western world. And many of those tablets, of course, have been destroyed, never to be to recover. Many of them probably ended up in the cellars of the Vatican, along with many of the books from the Library of Alexandria in 415 AD, and many of the Mayan codices that weren't burned by Bishop Diego de Landa in the 16th century. So this is just the next stage of that. But a key issue here is that when the US, the guys of Paul Bremer, who was the US ambassador to Iraq, when he imposed on the fledgling Iraqi government the constitution, incorporated in that constitution was Article 81, which specifically prohibits Iraqi farmers from saving their seeds and requires that they purchase their seeds from an approved supplier. Guess who that might be? Yeah, Monsanto. You're good. This is a book that was written actually a couple of years ago by William Engdahl, and he lives in Germany now. And I'm pleased to say that he's speaking at our next Alternative View conference in the UK. He's written 3 books in the last few years: Oil Wars, Seeds of Destruction, and the latest one is Full Spectrum Dominance. Well, let me just quote from a review that a friend of mine sent me before the book was available in the UK. He said, Ian, you have to really read this book. And this was the review he sent. I think this pretty much sums up what William Engdahl discovered. He said, this skillfully researched book focuses on how a small socio-political American league seeks to establish control over the very basis of human survival the provision of our daily bread. And this is a paraphrase from Henry Kissinger. Kissinger actually said, control the oil and you control nations, control the food and you control the people. This is no ordinary book about the perils of GMO. Engdahl takes the reader inside the corridors of power, into back rooms of the science labs, behind closed doors in the corporate boardrooms. The author cogently reveals a diabolical world of profit-driven, political intrigue, government corruption and coercion, where genetic manipulation and the patenting of life forms are used to gain worldwide control over food production. If you only read one book on this subject, read this one. What we are seeing is the furtherance of an agenda, goals and objectives that are actually part of National Socialism. And National Socialism was very well financed by the Rockefellers, and as was their genetic engineering research. And IG Farben was the chemical pharmaceutical conglomerate established by Hitler by putting together the four pharmaceutical companies of Agfa, Bayer, Herx, and BASF. And they were major finances was during the Second World War of Hitler. And also, I mean, they carried out horrendous experiments. Auschwitz was a work camp. Auschwitz was an IG Farben work camp. And the inmates of that camp were used to conduct medical experiments. This is the mugshots of 15 of the senior executives of IG Farben who stood trial at Nuremberg at the end of the Second World War. All of these 15 were sentenced to time in jail. By 1956, 3 of these guys were heading up the 4 companies that had once again been spun out of IG Farben, BASF, Herx, Bayer, and Agfa. At the end of the Second World War, the Americans had a project called Project Paperclip, which was about getting scientists and engineers from Germany across to the US. Now, a lot of people think that this was just a rocket scientist, the Werner von Braun and co. It wasn't. It wasn't just that at all. It was every scientist and engineer that they could possibly get out of the country before the Russians managed to get hold of them. In fact, the Americans actually gave up on reaching Berlin ahead of the Russians because they instructed Patton to go down to Czechoslovakia and get all the scientists and engineers that were working down at the Skoda factory just across the border. So we have seen, literally in the last few weeks, the implementation, the final step in terms of the European part of the agenda, of establishing a federalist Europe. I mean, what has been achieved is effectively what was Hitler's goal, but it's been achieved by surreptitious means. Because this is what Europe looked like at the end of the Second World War, 27 sovereign nations, all effectively determining their own economic, political, cultural, spiritual future. But over the last 52 years, of course, just 52 years and we've achieved that. Sovereign nations in Europe ostensibly no longer exist. National elections are nothing more than a complete charade. I have a document dated 1971, 4 years before the British participated in a referendum as to whether Britain should join the European Economic Community, as it was then. And in that document, it was marked for cabinet eyes only, which is the inner sanctum of the British government. And it said, once the British people commit to Britain's entry into the European Economic Community, it will be the role of government to conceal from the people the magnitude of power being handed over to the federal government. And that was 1971. So clearly the agenda has been very well known, across the